glad you're here. I'm glad to see you. And I invite you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter number 6. 2 Samuel chapter number 6. Pastor Stephen Cole, who is retired and was a pastor in Flagstaff, Arizona, relates the story that he read out of a 1982 Reader's Digest article in which this story tells about a church where there was a low rail running across the entire front of the worship center, and the choir stood behind it, but when they sat, they were sitting at eye level with the congregation. Now, some of the more creative members of that choir had discovered that they could go through the singing part of the worship service and then present their anthem before the congregation, but once they were seated, no one could see them. So some of those choir members also discovered that if they got down really low, like on their hands and knees, they could crawl out and exit the side door and go to that brand new donut shop right next to the church and then make their way back into the choir loft, and no one would know. But one Sunday morning, one of the more distinguished gentlemen in the choir decided he would try it. It was like it had turned his turn to go make the trip. So he got down on his knees and he left, and he did so successfully. He got a bag of a dozen donuts and re-entered the worship center, got down on his hands and knees, but he realized he couldn't make that trip with those donuts in his hand, so he puts them in his mouth. He puts the bag in his mouth. He looks like a dog walking around with something hanging out of his mouth, and he was moving across that stage, and he thought he was doing it without being noticed. When, about halfway through, there was an eruptive laughter in the congregation. For the first time, he looked to his left as he was crawling back in, and he saw the entire congregation because he was on the wrong side of the banister. That's a funny story. It was intended to be funny when it was written in Reader's Digest. It was intended to be funny when Pastor Stephen Cole related it in a sermon he told, but when I read that sermon he had written, it gripped me. It gripped me that it wasn't funny, because that's the way a lot of us treat worship. We don't realize it, but we become so familiar with the very holiness of God that we make presumptions, and we treat the holiness of God as if it were insignificant. This text today is all about this subject. We will call it Trifling with Holiness. Will you stand as we read together from God's Word? 2 Samuel chapter 6, I'll be reading verses 1 through 4. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel. Now, David has finally been fully anointed as king of Israel. And this group that we last encountered, these chosen men, have grown from 400 now to 30,000. David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God. This is what we call the Ark of the Covenant. The word ark means box. And you will remember that there were laws related to the treatment of this box. It was no ordinary box. It was about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and about that tall. And it was ornate. And the box was never intended to present the idea that in this box dwelt the presence of God. God had instructed the device, the creation of this box, and it was intended to represent a meeting place where God would meet with His people. And because of that significance, this box was holy. Bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim, these molded, shaped, angelic beings, formed, as it were, a seat back on this box, and they represented the seat where God ceremoniously sat to encounter His people. That seat, known as the mercy seat. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. May God bless our reading of His Word. You may be seated. I just want to recount for you what happens in the rest of this chapter. Now, David had just twice defeated the Philistines. These Philistines are especially hostile and angry now at David and at Israel because David had desecrated the altars of the false gods of the Philistines. If there was ever a time they would want to retaliate and in some way desecrate the godly things of Yahweh, now was that time. The Ark of the Covenant, this box, would be especially targeted by the Philistines. That being said, David established Jerusalem as his monarchy, the place where the expansion of his reign would be viewed. It would now be the capital city of Israel. And for obvious reasons, but not to overlook them, David wanted the Ark of the Covenant with him in Jerusalem. First of all, it would be more protected in this city, this Jebusite city, where his royal guard was. It would also, in all likelihood, bring honor to the city. He was making representation that his monarchy was not about him. It was about Yahweh. Yahweh had chosen him. Yahweh had continued with him through the life of King Saul, his predecessor. And now Yahweh had established him as king. And this presence of the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem would mean God was here. Not that God isn't everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. Theologically, understand this. There is nowhere God is not. However, God oftentimes will manifest His presence. We are told repeatedly in the Psalms that He inhabits, He lives in the praises of His people. If you want to experience this manifest presence of God, just begin to praise Him. You pay attention to God, and God will demonstrate Himself to you. And so, David calls for the ark to be brought to Jerusalem. And in a manner of respect and reverence to this ark, this box, a brand new cart is used. One that has never been used. It's not filthy, having carried other things. It's clean. This in itself is an intended act of reverence. Reverence to the ark and a reverence to God. However, that is not how the law said that David or anyone else was to transport the ark. There were very clear instructions about it. You can read it in Numbers chapter 4, verse 15. Rings had been placed on the ark. 4, one at each corner. And through those rings, rods were to be placed. And the Ark of the Covenant was to be transported only on the backs or shoulders of Aaronic priests. A mere oversight. An understandable and perhaps overlookable mistake on the part of David, but not on the part of God. You see, we trifle with holiness when we make assumptions concerning holiness. In the early 20th century, German theologian Martin Buber, in an attempt to describe the distinction between God and His creation, remarked that God is the holy other. He is in no way like us. Oh yes, He created us in His image. But make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, having created us in His image, we went on to ruin that creation by the fall, by our sin. And that sin is so decimating that God is holy, H-O-L-Y, and W-H-O-L-L-Y, different than us. And when we begin to be inconsiderate, or shall I say lacking in our consideration of this complete difference between ourselves and God, we are trifling with the holiness of God. And we are doing so by making assumptions that in some way God can be impressed by us. I work hard to bring messages. Sam works hard to prepare a service for the worship of God. But it is possible, and may I say easy, to find some method or some approach that results in what we think glorifies God, and then to repeat that. Just do it as if there is some formula for the worship of God that we can tap into, we can follow, we can find. When I was growing up, it was the generation in which I was born that thought it was different. The problem was everybody in my generation looked just alike. And there's no difference today. We find something and we mark it cool. And the next thing you know, everybody's doing it. Everybody's being cool, may I say, about worship. That there are cool things about worship. We find things we like. We mark them cool. And then we begin to rate churches based upon what they do that is cool. I ask you, what does any of that have to do with the holiness of God? Let's continue. You see in verses 5 through 7 that little, what seems to be little, oversight on how this thing was to be carried, this Ark of the Covenant, it comes to pass. This seed of a sin germinates. And the offspring of that sin is delivered on the day of transport. Verse 5, David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. Who could have foreseen that? To be on the safe side, we put it in a brand new cart. To be on the safe side, we had someone leading and someone following this cart. But as we come to this threshing floor, which merely indicates that there is a lot of rubble on the ground, and this oxen-drawn cart carrying the Ark of the Covenant becomes unstable on that unlevel ground. And Uzzah does what most of us would do. This is the Ark of the Covenant. And David the king has assigned me this task. Obviously, he wants this ark guarded. Verse 7. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah. And God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. What was so wrong about this? My goodness gracious. How in the world could God do such a thing? How in the world could this good, holy God be so inconsiderate that he would, and the scriptures doesn't say this man just died. It says God struck him down. What kind of God is this? Well, this is, ladies and gentlemen, a holy God. He's not like you. And for you to judge God as if he were like you is for you to misunderstand the very nature of God. But not only was that act of touching the ark a representation of Uzzah's misunderstanding the nature of God, it was also Uzzah's false understanding of the weakness of God. Who had designed this ark? God had. Who had given the laws about how to treat this ark? God had. Who was responsible for this ark? God was. And when Uzzah reaches out and touches this ark, he is trying in some way to protect something that represents the holiness of God. We are trifling with holiness when we try to protect God. I don't know how many times I've watched scholars, apologetic scholars, philosophers, and theologians try to defend certain aspects of the nature of God. And I also don't know how many times I've been impressed by their intelligence. And ladies and gentlemen, I don't belittle any of that, but in the end, whether they successfully defend the nature and character or existence of God or not, it doesn't change God one bit. God doesn't need our defense. God doesn't desire our defending Him. God desires our obedience to Him. And so often we are more fastidious, more careful about somehow trying to prove that God needs us, that we demonstrate our foolishness by failing to obey a God that if we really had any grasp on who God is, we would know we don't even begin to understand this God. We trifle with holiness when we make assumptions about the holiness of God. When we try to defend God, we trifle with holiness when we begin to cut corners in our worship of God. You can't overlook what happens next in this story. Verse 8. David was angry. David was angry. And scholars have come down into two camps. Why was David angry? And I want to share with you why I think neither camp is correct. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? A couple of things here that have to be considered. Number one, God did not tell David to do any of this. This was David's desire. Was it a good desire? That depends on how God felt about it, doesn't it? That doesn't depend on how the crowd felt about it or even how David felt about it. How often do we simply draw the conclusion that God needs something that we can provide Him? Hello? And then, in our effort to do something for God, as if God needs us to do anything for Him, in our attempt to do something for God, what we display is our significance, not His. And then, when God doesn't react to us the way we want Him to react, we don't know what to do. If we had begun the process by seeking the Lord's will from the beginning, from the start, God, is this what you want me to do? I desire to do this. I do want to do this. But it's irrelevant what I desire and what I want. What matters is what you want. We would not end up feeling comfortable about cutting corners in our process. When God guides us, we are not permitted to cut corners. We trifle with the holiness of God when we begin to cut corners in our worship of that God. I got to let you go because you have places to be and things to do. And I don't want to interrupt or interfere with anything else that you've got going on today because you are busy people. And I understand that. You have an hour this week that you can give to God. And I don't want to waste that hour. But I just want to remind you and me that if all we have for God is an hour, then God does not have all of us. You see, in the traditional liturgical process of worship, there is, in the beginning of a worship service, a thing called a call to worship. Now, I'm not advocating it. I've always thought it was pretty ho-hum, call to worship. Because no one ever explained what a call to worship was. But in the liturgical worship process, this is the place, the time where the people of God are brought to focus on their aim for this event. It is not about you anymore. It is all about Him. That is a call to worship. But if the call to worship is the first preparation you have made for worship, then you aren't ready to worship. I have lots of hobbies. Love doing certain things. I'm not good at any of them. I don't pretend to be. There is one thing I exist on this earth to do, and that is to glorify God. And one of my prime responsibilities is leading you to know Him and follow Him better than you are. If there is anyone in this house that needs to be ready for this hour, it's me. So I don't like to do my hobbies the day before church. If I do something like that, whether it's yard work or whether it's playing golf or fishing or hunting or any of that stuff, I am done by noon. Because I want to be ready for this hour. When did you get ready for worship? In your getting ready for worship, did it involve arguing with somebody else? Did it involve making sure you looked good in the mirror for somebody else? Did it involve driving to church like you were driving to work? With the same snide remarks you make about other people that you make during the week? Is this how you came to church today? Then you cut some corners. Because, ladies and gentlemen, God is not that box. Nor is God in that box we call the Ark of the Covenant, as God is not this house, and God is not contained in this house. God is omnipresent. That means He is everywhere. And when you come to worship, if you think you can just flip a switch and God is somehow going to be impressed by the transformation that you made that moment you came through the door or that moment of the downbeat of the first song, you are sadly mistaken. We are trifling with God when we cut these corners. And we cut them in our lives every day. Finally, we trifle with God and with His holiness. And we can expect accountability. Why did God strike Uzzah? I've tried to explain it. That's not what God had told them to do to begin with. It is not how God told them to do it to begin with. But also, it was not who God told them to do it with. While Uzzah was no doubt a Levitical priest, in all likelihood, he was a Levitical priest. There is no indication he is an Aaronic priest. It wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. It wasn't how he was supposed to be doing it. And only God knows if he was supposed to do it at all. And David is responsible for all of it. So David is mad. Is he mad because God struck Uzzah down? Some scholars say yes, that's why he was mad, because God struck Uzzah down, and all of a sudden David is taken aback by God. Other scholars say that David is mad at Uzzah because Uzzah has touched the Ark of the Covenant in violation of the law as described in Numbers chapter 4, and that David is mad at Uzzah, and the name of the place, Perez Uzzah, is because David is mad at him. Uzzah has broken out, which is supposed to be a description of what happened. This man exploded. I don't think it was either one of those things. I think this is the first time David has thought about God. You read the story, God is missing from this story. Up to this point, all of a sudden, God steps in and rains on David's parade. That's why David is mad. Because this was all about David. There's a lot more to this story. I wish I could finish this message. I'm not going to. There's a wife named Micah, or Michael, who isn't at the parade. She's not there at the party. She's observing from a window loft, and she sees David 3 months later when he brings the Ark of the Covenant successfully into Jerusalem, and he gets ecstatic. He goes crazy, singing and dancing and worshiping God, just like he had done here in this portion of the story. And Michal is livid. And she makes accusations against David that are unfounded. They're just untrue. She claims that David has become immodest, and yet the description is that David has covered himself with an ephod of linen. This ephod of linen was a priestly apparel. It was a linen garb that went over the body and was tied around like a sash. Aaronic priests would tie that sash with a belt containing the Urim and the Thummim. The reason that David was in linen cloth is David was functioning as a priest. There is another priest in the Old Testament who was also a king. His name is Melchizedek, the prince, it says, of Salem. It seems that David has the role and responsibility that Melchizedek had, and that was to govern the people and to represent God. It did not make him a Levitical priest. It did not make him an Aaronic priest. It made him a kingly or royal priest. We know someone else in that same vein. His name is Jesus. Now, if you combine all these events on the second go-round of David's taking the ark into Jerusalem, here's what you conclude. Excuse me. You conclude that there are some mistakes that we make that are insignificant. What tie should I wear? There's some things we decide that are irrelevant. But when it comes to holiness, nothing is irrelevant. And I want you to pay attention to me. Hear me now as I conclude. I want you to hear this. God knows everything. The person next to you doesn't know a fraction of what God knows about you. He knows your authenticity and sincerity. He knows your obedience, and He knows your motive. And when it comes to holiness, a divine attribute of God, when it comes to this, holiness, we are accountable for every aspect of our interaction with the holiness of God. you make assumptions about it, you cut corners regarding the holiness of God, or you somehow try to help God in His holiness, you are accountable for it. David said, how in the world am I going to take this Ark of the Covenant in? If God's going to step in like this, interfere with my parade, how am I going to get the Ark into Jerusalem? So what do? They find a nearby Levitical priest that can house this Ark of the Covenant, and lo and behold, God begins to bless that man. Apparently his crops are fertile and his family enlarges, and the word comes back to David that actually there are blessings to having the Ark of the Covenant around. Look at this priest. And the second time David attempts to bring the Ark of the Covenant in, but he does it entirely different. This time it is carried on the shoulders of Aaronic priests. This time they take 6 steps and offer a sacrifice, expensive sacrifices, and oxen. This is a 6-mile trip. And some Hebrew scholars believe that the language signifies that they did this every 6 steps. This is a different way to come in Jerusalem, ladies and gentlemen. And Michal couldn't enjoy it. She was detached. This was about something she had no interest in. What she had an interest in was how her husband was acting, what he was doing. Let me just say this. When you come into the house of God, other people are coming into this house of God too, and that is none of your business. They're not here to worship you. They're not here to please you. They're not here to worship according to your protocol or my protocol. We all have our tastes. Some like the 7-fold amen at the end of a hymn. Others like toe tapping, hand clapping. It's irrelevant what you or I like. What is relevant is why we're here. We are in this place to worship the one and only true God whose holiness distances Him so far from us that we can't comprehend or gap that distance. As Isaiah said, the heavens are above the earth, so are God's ways and God's thoughts above yours and mine. And yet, God transcends that distance to come into our midst when we authentically worship Him. Let's pray.